Welcome back to Switch to Linux. Well, today we're going to be looking at the Debian 10 release candidate 3. So Debian is generally considered one of the #1 granddaddies of all Linux. It's not the oldest, but it's pretty close to up there. And it does move pretty slow. And a lot of the reason is it is very rock solid stable. Now, the advantages of Debian is that stability. It's not going to fail you under most cases. You're not going to come in after an update and have system failure. The updates push the security updates, generally no feature updates, generally no package updates. Now, this leads to the sometimes criticism that Debian has older and out-of-date packages, and the reality is it does. So I just poked around with experimenting with this release candidate. You know, the Gnome default is 3.30. That's a little bit older. GIMP is, it's fairly new, but it's certainly not the latest cutting edge. Same with LibreOffice. But the thing that you do get with Debian is everything is going to be very compatible. You have large repositories. You have 64 and 32-bit release candidates, which is going to be the same here. And so the latest version here, the release candidate 3 is now out as of July 2nd, and we are going to just tell you how you can go ahead and test this out. So never run a release candidate test on a main production system. So either install it to a USB hard drive. In my case, we're going to be looking at this in a virtual machine. And so when we get to the page, this is actually where we can download our images. So we have the various differences here. Now, Debian can be the most confusing to download. It's not like, hey, here's your single image and here you go. They are so compatible with so many different things. We have the AMD 64, the ARM 64, ARM EL, ARM HF, i386. So there's so many different options that we have, and that's one of the things that makes it so enduring, that it can pretty much be used on virtually anything. And so I generally just download the net installer. This is the smallest download size. I think it's 350 megabytes, and it requires you to go on and access the internet for installing anything. Now, if you do not have ready access to the internet, but you do need to make sure you have everything, you want to come way down to the other end and grab the DVDs, and this is pretty much everything. You grab this one time, it's going to be a massive download, and then you have that. So you can actually burn that onto DVDs, USB drives, whatever else you need to do. Just pop it into a virtual machine to grab the information off of it. You can set up servers with that for yourself so that you can install off of that. So there's other things that you can do. Of course, there's live candidates. Here's a Blu-ray disc. That's neat. Various other images, USB sticks, things like this. So I generally just use the net install, which you can put to a standard CD. You can use it on a virtual machine. You can burn this to a USB drive. So I went ahead and downloaded that. And so what we're going to do now is let's just kind of jump on over and look at our virtual machine setup here. So kind of here's my virtual machine. We're just going to go ahead and overrun this Salient OS here. So let's just go ahead and change the settings down to Debian. Do Debian 10, RC3, and then it's already set to Debian 64 as I have a 64-bit image. And what we're going to do is just pop this guy in the disk. So this is called Debian Buster. Here's your release candidate 3. And we're just going to go ahead and boot this guy up. And so when we boot this guy up, we are over here. We have the option to install. We have a graphical installer, and there's advanced options. We're just going to go ahead and do the graphical installer. This will be the easiest for you if you are more of a newbie type guy. Of course, if you already know what you're doing, go and just do the standard install through the terminal. It's just about as easy. All right, so here we're just going to go through the various settings. Now, Debian is not the easiest to configure, but it does give you some of the best options out of the box. And so we're just going to go through. It's auto-detecting some basics. Just change these settings to what your defaults happen to be. There will be times in the installation process where I'll go ahead and pause the video, like the full solid installation step is going to take a little bit more time. One of the great things about this distribution is you have the choice of your desktop environments and things like that. Now, the default Debian desktop environment is Gnome, and so you can see what that looks like. You can actually install multiple desktop environments. Now, there could be some conflicts with doing multiple desktop environments. Just be aware of that. All right, so host name for the system. We're just going to do everything here as Debian. So click on the next. Now it needs a domain name. Once again, I'm going to find Debian. This is just if you need to access it on the network. So now, one of the things that Debian does a little bit different than a lot of your more common distributions is it gives your main sudo user, or your main user is added to the sudo group. Debian does not do that. And so here we are setting a root password here. And next it's going to have us set up your basic user. So you can add this basic user to the sudo group to do administration on the system, but by default it does not do that. That actually sounds like an inconvenience, but that actually adds to the stability of Debian. Of course, I always go in and add the sudo user because, I mean, there's not ready access to my computers. If they were, had a more public space or were running my computers in different locations, I would probably not do that. Now, when it comes down to this is where there used to be an issue with this. Hopefully there won't be. We're going to give this a test. On my first test run of this, I did not have the problem. So what used to happen is when you came in here to partition the disk is it would throw an error. I'd need to come in, boot off of something else, wipe the disk, and then go ahead and install. Hopefully this will work. If it doesn't, we'll just kind of walk through that step. All right, so here you have the option to use the entire disk. This is recommended if you are a newbie. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. And then we are picking the disk. And then down here, do we want all files in one partition? Or do we want a separate home partition or separate home, var, and temp partitions? Generally, unless you have a reason to put everything in a separate partition, just use the top option. If you are using the same account, installing multiple different distributions or putting your home partition somewhere else on a separate disk, so like a common thing with a lot of Windows development, you have your operating system on an SSD and all of your files on a separate disk. You'd want to do a separate. But in this case, we're just going to go ahead and do everything all in one. Okay, so this is actually where it's going to partition the drive. So it is going to set up so we have a separate boot, we have some swap. Now this is the step here where we actually have to come down, toggle this down to yes. This is the final yes, we are writing the changes to the disk. At this point forward, your disk is overwritten. So do not do this if you are not intending to erase that disk. If you do need to install and work around some existing configurations, you're going to need to manually partition it and manually set up what is going where. Definitely an option. We're not going to do that in this video because we just want to get this installed and have a brief look at this release candidate. Okay, so over here, this is where it asks us, are we installing a separate CD or DVD? So since we are using the net installer, everything is online, so we are not going to do anything. If you happen to be using a DVD set and you need to install a second disk, maybe read separate packages, go ahead and put that in. In our case, in this step, we are hitting no. So now it asks us to configure the package manager. Just pick something that's closest to you. There's a variety of different mirrors. I'll just use deb.debian.org. And then this step here, if you need to use any proxy to get on the internet, you need to configure that here. Most users are just going to leave that blank. So now it's going to configure app, and then it's going to update your mirrors, and we will have a choice in software to install. Okay, this is the controversial step. Do we want to install a popularity contest? So this is the application that once a week is going to run a script. It's going to send a list of the most used applications to Debian. The default here is no. Ubuntu, of course, installs this by default, although it does not specifically activate it, which is curious. In this case here, the default is no. If you just skip no, it's not going to install. If you like to use it, you can go ahead and hit yes, and that's going to install the package. So we're just going to say no at this point. And here we need to decide what software we are going to install. Now the Debian desktop environment, this is going to install Gnome. We have other options: Gnome, XFCE, KDE Plasma, Cinnamon, Mate, LXDE, LXQT. We can install a web server or not. We can install a print server or not, SSH server or not, or standard system utilities or not. So in this case, let's actually, I'm trying to think what else I want to install. Plasma would be a neat option. You know what? I want to see what version of Cinnamon they're running. So that would be interesting for me. So we're going to go ahead and do this. Now, you can actually install multiple desktop environments here. Let's go ahead and install two. Let's go with Gnome and Cinnamon. I think mine I have one that has KDE, Cinnamon, and Mate, actually. We're going to go ahead and run with this. This is going to take a little bit to download all the files and install it, so I will be back when this is done grabbing the software. Okay, so the next step is we need to install Grub. So Grub is going to be your bootloader. You need to have whatever disk you're booting your computer off of, you need to have some type of bootloader that will look for operating systems to install. So Grub is generally what you find, although there is a Windows version one as well. So we do want to install Grub here, otherwise while the operating system may be installed, we can't access it. So let's go ahead and continue. And then here we have to choose where it's going. This is where some simpler installers don't give you the option and it automatically installs it to the first drive, which is why I recommend pulling your first drive out of your computer prior to installing a Linux distribution on a secondary drive. In this installer, I could set which device to put this on. So I'm just going to come down here and select this as the only option. This is the only drive we have, and that's exactly where I would like to install Grub to. So let's go ahead and click Next. And this will take just a moment, and then it's going to do a couple finalization steps, and then we should be set to go. Now, what this is going to do is once this installer is done, we just hit the continue button to restart the system, and then it's actually going to kick the USB drive out that we booted from, and then it's going to restart the system with our build. So here we are booting into our system based on our installation settings. Okay, so here, now we are logged in here. We'll see we got Debian 10 going on down here. We're going to click our username. Now remember we installed a couple different desktop environments. This gear will let us pick. Do we want to go Cinnamon, Cinnamon software rendering, System X11 default, which I believe is going to be Gnome. We have Gnome, Gnome Classic, and Gnome on Xorg. So I'm guessing that this Gnome is probably on Wayland is my guess. So I wanted to see what version of Cinnamon we have. So we're going to go ahead and pick Cinnamon. Now it might kick me back down into software rendering mode. Most likely it's going to, but we're going to go ahead and have a look at that. All right, so it did kick us back down into software rendering mode. And here we have, let's go with, is it about, I always get it mixed up. I think it's system info. All right. Not sure I actually hit that. Oh, I did. All right. So we are running Cinnamon version 3.8.8. Of course, Cinnamon 4 is out, and that makes this a little bit older of a version of Cinnamon, and that's what some people have that criticism of Debian. Now, does it matter if you're on 3.8.8 or 4? It depends if you want the new features or not. For me, I mean, I like them both. I generally set my system up the way this version does instead, and so I'm happier with this one in all honesty. It doesn't really matter to me though. We can see our Linux kernel is 4.19, and you can see the other information that we have inside this system. Now, as far as default installation software, we have basic accessories. Now, Cinnamon itself comes with some extra tools that are installed on this that you may not find if you just install the basic default. We do have several games installed. Ooh, Nibbles. Is that kind of like, okay, that's a guided worm maze. Yum. All right. We have graphics. So we have GIMP pre-installed. GIMP was not pre-installed when I ran my test earlier, nor was Inkscape. So I think adding Cinnamon added a few of these other options. We have Firefox ESR. So ESR is kind of like a Firefox long-term. And it is version 60, so it's not the most up-to-date, but what this is it's so that the system, the versions don't keep rolling, but we just get security updates. That's why Debian uses Firefox ESR. You can manually install a non-ESR version if you'd like. Here we have the full version, full suite of LibreOffice. I'm not actually seeing the databasing there, but so it's not quite the full Office, but it's pretty close. We do use Evolution, which is something Debian has by default. That's, of course, my preferred email client. We have a couple of different media players built in there, and then we have some basic system administration. So as far as installing software, we do have the Software Center, which is the Gnome Software Center, and these are, of course, the configuration options. So if you want to come into the Software Center here, you can go ahead and install, here we can see what we already have installed. So if you need to remove something, you can do that. You can come into here and let's look at audio video. So here we have versions. Let's see what version of Kdenlive we have. So we have version 18.12 of Kdenlive. This is probably a good one because the Kdenlive 19 caused a little bit of controversy for some people. Let's go ahead and just install that. So we'll just click our username in there. As far as how many system resources this is using, let's see if HTOP is installed. I'm not sure it's going to be, but let's go ahead and give it a test. So HTOP is not installed. We can install it, but there actually is a system monitor in here. So we'll just use the one that's built into the system. All right, so we are at 1.1 gigs, but mind you, we are installing an application right now. When I tested this under Gnome, it was under 1 gig, so the system is actually running pretty well. It actually did run fairly well when I tested out earlier, and that, I believe, was Gnome based on Wayland, which always does a system performance hit on virtual machine. As far as GIMP, GIMP is going to be 210. It's not the absolute latest 210, but it is still 210. So if that's a concern of yours, you have that. Same with LibreOffice. It's going to be 6.1. Of course, the 6.2 branch of LibreOffice is out. Let's see. There's about GIMP. So we have 2.10.8 on GIMP. And LibreOffice is configured already with a lot of different tools and plugins. So we have the option in there. We already have spell checkers built in. We already have synonyms built in. All those things that some distributions have it installed by default, some distributions do not. So I always like checking it. This is not the absolute latest version, so the ability to turn on the ribbon function is not built into this version yet, I don't think. Let's just go ahead and do my spelling checker. You can see that my spelling checker is working. So we'll go down here to spelling, and we also have synonyms built into the system as well. All right, so if this had the ability to install the ribbon, then I would have another option down here under the user interface. That was actually introduced in version 6.2. This is still using version 6.1.5.2. Do I care about that? No, I hate the ribbon. But for those that like it, you want to install a version of LibreOffice that has 6.2 or later, because that has the ability to install that. So as far as everything else, it does seem to be, it's Debian. What do you want? It's Debian. It's good. It's stable. Let's see what themes we have built into Cinnamon. All right, so we just have a couple basic themes built in, nothing super special, so that is good. Here's, let's see what we got. There's our green submarine screen there, all right. We have a few options there for our theming. Let's do with that. Let's go with oxygen, window borders. That's fine. All right, so here we have some basic theming options. Of course, we have the ability to come in here and update this cache and look for other themes that are compatible with this. So if you did want to use some other themes, you can go ahead and just install some from in here. We're not going to worry about the theming. I have a separate video on how to theme Cinnamon. All right, let's go ahead and log out, and then we're going to log back in under Gnome, and we will have a look at what that looks like. All right, so we'll click this, go down to our gear. I'm actually going to do Gnome on X because it generally performs better in a virtual machine. So let's go ahead and do that. I want to see how this looks compared to how it did when I was testing it earlier. All right, so here, of course, if we come down to our settings here, then we'll come down to our details. You can see we're running 3.30.2. So again, it's not the absolute latest version. This is a release candidate. They could update, but most likely they won't. All right, so software availabilities. So of course, what we would expect, this is everything that we had before. Here's that Kdenlive that was built in. And let's go ahead and look for the system monitor. So you can see this guy here is running at 1.1 gigs right now. Now it might be because we went to X instead of running on Wayland, but again, a criticism of this, how much RAM usage is it using type approach is sometimes it matters how fast the system is, how much RAM it's actually using. I'm actually finding this fairly snappy. So let me go ahead and let's go ahead and log in under the default, which I'm pretty sure is going to be Wayland, and we'll kind of show you what we're talking about there. So we'll come down over here, come down into Gnome system default. All right. So let's just kind of do the same stuff. So if you're noticing it, I'm noticing it on my end. It is a little bit more sluggish. It's not like horrible, super bad, but it is a little bit more sluggish. It is using, of course, slightly less RAM in this case, but it is not running quite as well. Now, some of that is because this is running in a virtual machine, and I've just found that Wayland-based distros just don't tend to run as smoothly in a virtual machine as they do on real hardware. So that's not a major criticism, but just note when you install Gnome, you have the X and the Wayland versions installed by default. And, everything else I'm seeing here, hey, it's Debian. What else do you want, So here is, let's go ahead and look at what backgrounds they give us by default. Just a couple there. Why are they giving us weird backgrounds? Like this is a Ubuntu background. I'm not sure why I got a Ubuntu background, but all right. There's some cool Debian backgrounds you can pick from. So if you wanted to do something like this, you can go ahead and there's a cool Debian background there. So they do actually give us just a few backgrounds. I think I'm using this one actually on my main Debian system, so I like that one quite a bit. All right, so this is Debian 10 Release Candidate 3. So go ahead and have a look at that if you are a tester, and use that a little bit on a spare machine, poke around in there, and send any bug reports back to them. That'll help the build come out faster and fix any issues that they have. So it definitely works good. The observations up front is the installer seems to work a little bit better than last time, where I was having an issue with Debian systems under Debian 9, where there's times I just had to manually format the hard drive before trying to install Debian. That seems to be resolved. Everything else is much the same as I always remember. It's just Debian with some later packages, and hey, that's good. And that's what makes Debian such a great system. So let me know your thoughts about Debian 10R. Are you excited for this release, or is it something you just don't really care about? Let me know in the comments down below.